Hello everyone, my name is Lizzie Karen and I have eventually decided to show my face and yeah, not very good at this. I will try and do this more often. I've had to learn how to do makeup and all kinds of crazy things that I don't normally do. But here I am, and this next episode is part 2 of a 2-part series on what I think about the stories of Plato. So basically the second part is really about how the measurements measure up in my dreams. So welcome to the episode, and I guess you'll be seeing a bit more of me. Bye. Okay, so I've been going through what Plato had to say, and I've been going through all my notes on what Atlantis was like in terms of how far it was from places and that sort of thing. And the concept, Plato's concept measures up, but the size and things, there's some big gaps there. And I've also been looking at all the various places that it could be. And I would really, I've nailed it down to a few possibilities, but the hottest contender, there is one that's the hottest contender. And I'd really like to say this hot contender is it, but I'm still not 100%. So the hot contender is the eye of the Sahara, which is the Richart structure. And it is the closest match so far, but it's still not 100%. And there are some little differences and there's some big differences. And I'm not sure if some of those big differences are because I don't have enough information about the eye of the Sahara, or if there's more to it. But I will explain more as we go along. In case you're new to my channel, this is what it's all about. Basically, I've had weird dreams all my life, and I've kept a record of them in journals. I'm now retired, so I'm telling you all these stories that came from my dreams, which I believe are regressions. I also think that they're of a place which so closely resembles Atlantis that even though it's been never referred to as Atlantis in any of these dream regressions, in my mind it is Atlantis, but to me it's called Tantal. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's just talk about how much of what Plato had to say is history, in my opinion. A quick recap over what I've been through so far, because I've been through his writings on the subject, and I personally give no validity to any aspect that pertain to gods. So, in my analysis, I've also removed anything mythological sounding. So anything that sounds like gods, basically, or mythology. I've also taken out anything that sounds like it's an influence from another culture, like the influence of the warring Carthaginians, or even cultures that also are closer to Greece, Minoan and various ones that Plato would have been familiar with. And then I removed all the antiquated masculinity. For example, all the rulers were men, and they were born in sets of twins, 5 male twins, and they all became the leaders. It's like, what happened to all the females? I mean, occasionally they talk about female gods, but it's really quite amazing that leaning towards the male aspect, which was very big in Greece, and of course later in Rome, and of course later in many other places, but in Atlantis, it was not the case in terms of my regressions. So I took that out. And so what's left, in my opinion, we can seriously look at as a realistic record. And as it happens, what's left is a reasonable match to my dream regressions of Tantal. The size differs a bit, but the whole concept is pretty good. I should add one caveat before I begin, because during the time of Japay, he's one of the leaders. He was the last leader, and he decided that he preferred to be recognized as a god. So if any of the god stuff was actually from Atlantis, then it would be about Japay. But working out who was who after tens of thousands of years, well, that'd be a bit of a struggle for me. So let's just ignore all the god stuff, shall we? Oh, and as an aside, Japay, that ruler I was just mentioning, he didn't like women very much. But that's another story. And, yeah. Anyway, so today we're going to focus on measurements and how those measurements measured up. So you've probably heard many times from me that I have no way to get exact measurements, but I can give comparisons, like roughly the number of stories on a building, or a rough distance that I can then guess at being comparable to a current distance, which I can actually measure on Google Maps, which makes it a lot easier. So what I do is I roughly estimate based on a place in my waking world that seems to me to be about the similar sort of size. So the centralmost island of Tantal is roughly the size of an island in New Zealand that I'm very familiar with. And it's a nice circular island. It's called Rangitoto. And you should look it up. It's a beautiful place. Wasn't around 600 years ago, but it's around now. By that I mean it's a volcano. And it's in the harbour of Auckland, and it's beautiful. Anyway, that's by the by. So, as I said, the island that I refer to is circular, and it's a very good approximation to the central island of Tantal. And that's quite a lot larger than Plato's version. But I have no idea how to translate a stade. When I did a search on how big is a stade, there's like stades for Egyptian stade, the Greek stade, it's really, really confusing. So I have no idea really how big Plato's version was. But just looking at it roughly from the Greek stade, it does look as if the version from Plato looks a bit on the small side. And when you look at any artistic representations of Atlantis, they look so tiny. It looked like a really small place. Not anything size-wise that compared to what I'm used to in my dream regressions. Anyway, so the outermost island, I must point out, in my regressions was not perfectly circular, but the middle island and the inner island were both absolutely perfectly circular and equidistant. So none of these islands were totally flat. The central island was raised up, and the middle island had some flat bits and some raised like hilly bits, just gentle hills, And the third island was mainly flattish, but it did have hilly bits as well. It also had a complete beach. The whole area at the third ring, the outer aspect of it, was just a gentle slope to a beach, and it was a beautiful beach. So next, how close was the whole thing to major waterways? Well, there were so many rivers and lakes around in my dream regressions that they acted as landmarks for me. And that's what's made it so hard for me to find where I think that Tantal is. And you see, it was easy to find Kim and easier even to find Neath because, yeah, they'd been through changes, but they still looked essentially similar to the way they did in my dream regressions. But finding Tantal, well, that's another thing altogether. Without these rivers and lakes as landmarks, it's really, really difficult. So the nearest river was about 10 kilometers away, but the ocean was a lot further. At a guess, I would say the distance from Tantal to the ocean was about the same as the distance between Auckland in New Zealand, which is where I live, and a place called Palmerston North, also in New Zealand, and that's where I used to work. So it's rough, but it's the best I can do, because as I said, I don't have any way of measuring. I can also remember a very large waterfall nearby, probably within 50 k's, give or take. Yeah, beautiful one, really, really beautiful. In my dream regressions, there were hills surrounding mainly the northern aspect and the western aspect. But these were real hills. They weren't mountains as such. There were mountains, decent-sized mountains to the north, but they were a way off. And so that's a bit of a difference to what Plato had to say. So in terms of Plato, there are things that I can't really comment on because there were 3 eras to Tantal. There was the era of Uran, when the place was first built and first populated and everybody lived on the central island, and then more development went on and the innermost island got developed a bit more, and the outer island was mainly for production, for food. And then, of course, the second era was when Bellah took over and populations grew rapidly, grew massively, and the islands were not sufficient to either sustain the people nor accommodate them. And that's when the various plains outside of Tantal were developed, and that was after my time in Tantal. So I can't really talk about the plains much, but I can talk about the rings and the waterways and the canals and things like that. So the whole concept of the inner circle and the various rings, the canals that Plato mentioned, they all ring true, to my version of things from my regressions. And I just can't comment on the plains. The plains. So I've been through all my dream journals and I've done a compilation of all the things that I wrote down that could help with determining a location. So the first one was regarding canals. It's pretty much what Plato said. So let's talk about some of the specifics from my dream regressions. For example, all ships operated on and under the water. I do not remember seeing any boats that just floated, except for ones owned by the primitives, but not by us. And so all the ships were essentially submersibles. And that's quite a big subject, which I should probably do a whole episode on, because submersibles are actually quite interesting. So it's because of these submersibles that the canals were so big. But it's also very important to talk about the canals. Now, in Plato's version, the canal went from Atlantis all the way out to the sea, I think. Yep. But that's not how it worked for Tantal. The main canal went out to a river, which was about 10 kilometers away. And from there, it was possible to get to the ocean. However, there was a difference in the altitude. So Tantal was not at sea level. So that meant that heading down from the level that Tantal was on, through the river and down to the ocean, was not possible without the technology that we had put in place, which was a lock. So I will come back to that, because the locks we used were for many reasons. If we just had a regular canal that had utilized the full length, then for one thing, during the dry months, the river would be low and unnavigable. And two, the ability to return upstream, well, even when the river was high, that would still have been challenging, because there were waterfalls and they were beautiful, but they were not conducive to going up and down a river. And anyone in a regular boat might have been able to get down during the wet season, if they took their lives in their hands over the waterfalls, but they certainly wouldn't have been able to get back, neither in the wet season or the dry season. So the locks were vital. And one of those locks, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but it was underground, an underground lock. But without the locks, the water from Tantal would simply have drained out through the canal into the river, and in the dry season, the canals of Tantal would all have been empty. So a lock was preferred to a dam, because a lock was a lot less damaging than a dam. Anyway, as I said before, there are a lot of lakes around and a lot of rivers. The main river was down towards the south, and the sea was off to the west. So the main canal that left Tantal went southwest. There was one major lock before it joined up with the river, and the river headed westwards. So part of the canal, as I mentioned, went underground, and at one end of one of these locks, it came out at the very deep part of the river where the largest of the waterfalls was located. The reason is because in order to be able to go and return freely, that kind of lock was required. And I use the word lock carefully because I don't have any better word to describe. I don't think that there are such things as underground locks in our world, but they fill such a similar role to what we call locks that's what I'm calling them. I only remember one underground lock, but I'm not sure if there was only one. But anyway, it came out at the deepest part of the river where the really beautiful big waterfall was located. And the reason was that in order to be able to go and return freely, then without the underground lock, the change in elevation was too much, and it meant that it would have been very difficult for the submersibles to get past the great, beautiful waterfall. And since all the ships were submersible, a single really decent-sized lock made it much more feasible. So the location of the sea, as I said, was to the west, and I'm trying to think of the exact location of the lakes. I can see the lakes in my mind's eye, but I'm struggling to define exactly where they are. I know there was one, a big one, on the way to Kem, and there was several smaller ones, but yeah, it's difficult. Anyway, I'll continue on with the description. When we first moved to Tantal, everyone lived on the central island, as I mentioned, and that continued for thousands of years because the central island was a decent size. The two outer islands at that time were used for produce and security. Now, talking about security and even growing things is actually quite a big subject, and I could also talk about the ostrich racing, but I don't think I'd better get into that at this stage because otherwise the episode will get way too long. And then there's the universities, because each of the three islands, the central, the middle and the outer, each had a university. And as the population grew, the people, as I said, started to live on those middle and outer islands, not just the central one. At this stage also, the buildings generally were no more than 3 stories high, except for the things like the travel towers and the obelisks, which were very tall. I imagine that Plato's description pertains to how Atlantis was just before its destruction. And if we think about it in terms of Tantal, before Tantal was destroyed, well, I hadn't really been there for quite some time. So I don't actually know firsthand exactly what it was like at the end of the reign of Bela and completely through the reign of Japay. So that's rather a long time. I think I may have visited, but I'm not absolutely sure, as I've got no regressions that I've noted regarding the place at that time. So I really can't give a full description of what it was like by the end, but I can give a very, very detailed description of what it was like during the reign of Uran and in the early parts of Bela. And I can say that the population growth was one of the critical factors in how it changed, because food production had to move to a nearby plain because there was no longer the ability to grow all the food on the outer ring, because people wanted to live on the outer ring. And I believe people also started living on the plains and up in the nearby hills, because that's how much the population expanded. But I really have no exact details on how that was. And of course, all the islands had their own little hills. They weren't flat. And the central and middle island rings both of them had high walled areas from the canal, from the water, and it went all around, full distance around. There was not an entrance from the water. You either had to access it by flight or by being in one of the submersibles and going underwater to get inside. The last island, the outer island, had a wall in the innermost side, but the outer side was just a beach, as I said, a beautiful beach, and it went the full length, surrounded the whole of the outer ring. From the beach there was a gentle slope, as a general rule, that went upwards, a very gentle kind of gradient. The outer ring in particular had many, many beautiful trees, really beautiful, big, well-established trees, and a lot of areas that looked grassy, but I don't think they weren't like grass that we have today, but they looked kind of nice and easy to walk on kind of areas. And as I said, without a flying device or a submersible, the islands pretty much couldn't be accessed, even from each other. If you had a boat and you'd made it as far as the first ring, you could get up on to the outer island via the beach, but from there was absolutely no way to get from there across to the middle or inner islands. The submersibles, however, had tunnels underwater for moving between the islands, and obviously the submersibles and the flying machines were what was used to travel between the islands and in fact to travel outside of Tantal. The submersibles would access the oceans by the canals, which I guess is obvious from what I was describing earlier. And of course the locks were used to safely navigate the change in elevation, both leaving and returning. The simplicity and the excellent functional use of the place under Uran, it was efficient and yet it was very elegant. But after the massive population growth and the pressures on all the resources, the place kind of lost its simplicity. It didn't necessarily lose its beauty, but things became a lot more complicated. I understand from others, not from seeing with my own eyes in migrations, but I understand that the central island did get a lot of attention from Japay when he took over. He was into things being very ornate, and so he was really into making the buildings very ornate. Of course, he added a lot of temples and statues of himself, and added lots more gold and silver and the red gold. He also had a really big palace built for himself on the central island. There were 3 travel towers on each ring. I'm not sure if Japay added to that or not. When I first went to Tantal, there was only the 1 tower, but the other 2 were soon added. But I can't remember exactly what the time frames were on the building of the towers. But hey, that was all within the reign of Uran. So I think that pretty much covers most of the things that I can remember from my dream regressions. So in summary, Plato's version, although conceptually is a good match, it's a lot smaller than I remember in my regressions. But then again, I don't know how much the measurements have translated and distorted, and I don't know also if I'm getting the right conversion for the states. And I also mentioned about the fertile plains. They sound like they were during the era of Japay, when more land mass was required for the population growth. As indicated by the heading of this episode, where the bleep is Atlantis or Tantal? Oh, well, I'm not that sure. As I said, the Richart structure is the closest fit, but it's not a perfect fit. there could be good reasons why. Reasons like the way that the area was destroyed during the deluge, or maybe even how I remember it, or even things like the information that I get on it. Maybe it is a closer match than I think. I don't know, because I can't see on any of Google Maps or anything like that where all the rivers and lakes might have been, 30,000 years ago. So, and those were my landmarks. So I'll just touch on the issues with the Richart structure, or should I say the Eye of the Sahara, and how at this point it falls short in terms of my dream regressions. And by that I mean, at this point in time, I can't say that they're a good match, even though at this point in time it's also the closest match that I can find. So I'll just look at this list and explain it. So the first was, I cannot see on Google Maps or anywhere a hill which is towards the ocean side on the left. I can see the hills above it, which is what was in my regressions, but I can't see any hills towards the left. Unless I'm looking at it wrong, it's missing the hills that are towards the ocean side. The second point is the overall size. The recast structure is still a bit bigger than my estimates. It's not a major difference, and I do admit that my estimates are very rough, so that might not really be a big point. The third point is the lack of waterways, and I know that if I could see a map of what waterways were like 30,000 years ago, I'd be able to say, yes, it's it, or no, it isn't. But I don't have any way of getting a map of waterways from that era. So there are no landmarks for me to measure against. And without them, that makes it just so difficult. My fourth point is the waterfall. Now, this is quite a big landmark. And I've searched where I think where a waterfall might have been if the Richart structure was the one, and I can't see anywhere that might have been a decent sized waterfall or the remains of a waterfall or anything like that nearby. It's not that easy to see waterfalls on maps anyway, unless they're booming and you see all the white froth coming off them. I did actually find an area that looked like it could have been a waterfall, but it wasn't in the position, not in the exact position that I remember. So it was a bit further north than I was expecting it. But I'll put a picture of it up. Anyway, point number 5. Now this is one that can make or break the Richart structure for me, because after the Great Deluge, I was part of a team sent to rescue people that were trapped underground in, what we would call bunkers. Anyway, the whole place was covered in mud and water and stuff like that, and so we had to actually build very quickly, I might add, an area, a square area with large blocks, an area which we could then pump all the water and the mud out of, and then we could get access to doing a rescue of these people, which we did, by the way. We managed to do that very successfully, and that was another thing that I should really do a whole episode on, because there's a heap that I can tell you about that rescue. But the most important part from the perspective of is this Atlantis, is if we can find on the Richart structure an area where there are some very large blocks. They wouldn't have been destroyed in the deluge because we put them there after the deluge, and it is a square, and we cut sandstone, very, very large blocks of sandstone, and made about a 10 meter by 10 meter construction. There were no doorway accesses or anything because we wanted to make it so that we could pump out the water and the mud. So that structure, there is absolutely no reason why that structure would not still be there unless someone else came along at another date and removed it. And unless they were willing to cut it up or damage it, then I would say it should still be there in some form. Even if it's covered in a bit of sand and stuff, it should still be there. And that would be not only the evidence that this was in fact Tantal and Atlantis, it would also be an indication of where the access was through to the tunnels and the underground structure. So that would be something pretty major. If we could find that, it would be a big bonus. On the blocks, they were about 2, maybe 3 meters high, so they weren't insignificant. They should stand out. So, getting back to the whole point of this, Plato's story. Yes, I think it's a good enough match to say that Plato was describing the same place as my dream regressions. Yep, there's differences, but I mean, after all that time, one should expect there to be differences. Now, in terms of the Richart structure and Plato and my regressions, well, I've given you my reasons against it, even though I'm sure we can work towards finding out if they are valid reasons. But I haven't given you my reasons for why I was for it in the first place. Well, my main reason for my leaning towards the Richart structure is the distances from other locations that are known, that I am confident where they are. But I shall still continue to try and assess this, and if people are interested, I will do a more detailed episode on the Richart structure and do some more investigations. But because really I've just done a very high level look at it from what I can find out about it, and it's, I guess, what you would call a desk review? No, what do you call those things where you're doing an analysis, but you're doing it based on books and readings and internet and stuff like that. Anyway, you get the drift, don't you? If anyone's interested, I could put out a list showing you all the things that I'm considering doing an episode on, and people can comment on it. But let me know if you're interested. That would be useful for me to know before I go to all that effort. And I guess that's the end of this episode, so I will catch you all next time. Thanks. Bye.